This is Of Men and Dragons, Book 1, Chapter 10 by DrBlackjack21. When Jack woke up the next morning, something seemed off. It wasn't just the fact that his jaw felt as though a nasty bruise was forming, nor was it the fact that he couldn't move his arms. What was bothering him the most was the fact that there was a presence beside him, breathing heavily on the bed. As he cracked his eyes open, Jack quickly discovered the reason his arms were immobile. Someone tied them up in the middle of the night. What he could see from his prone position was a veritable maze of ropes and knots. Jack almost got a headache trying to figure out how they were all interconnected. Changing his focus to the presence beside him, he could see Shahar's back rising and falling as she took deep, even breaths. Jack tried to put together the previous night's events, but found he couldn't remember anything after sitting down for dinner. Something told him that maybe the standard dose of pain meds for a broken foot might have been a bit more than he could handle. Still, it could be worse. At least Shahar hadn't left him in a ditch somewhere. Just as he was trying to figure out what to do about his predicament, Shahar's breathing stilled. As she sat up and stretched, she looked over her shoulder at Jack, giving him a glare full of ice and knives. Somewhat uncomfortable with the current situation, Jack decided to break the awkward ice, metaphorically speaking. Looking down at the ropes around him, he thought it might be wise to accept responsibility. So, judging by the ropes and my jaw, I have some apologizing to do. I'm afraid that's the first in a long time I've taken pain meds that strong. I might have taken too high a dose. I honestly can't remember anything after dinner. I hope I didn't. That is to say, I hope I wasn't. Jack's apology floundered, but Shahar seemed to take a bit of pity on him. Her glare lost a bit of its icy edge before she spoke. Well, I resisted the urge to slap you after you all but professed your undying love to me last night. At that, Jack's face seemed even more pale than usual. But when you got handsy in the middle of the night... Jack's face now looked as white as snow, and his mouth moved with unvocalized terror. First I reacted. She glanced at his jaw. Then I resolved the problem. She glanced at the rope. Jack was a stuttering mess, tripping over his own words in an attempt to apologize faster. Shahar cut him off. I will forgive you just this once, so long as it never happens again. As I've already mentioned, you bought my services as a guide and guard. You didn't buy me. At that, Jack's face changed to an odd shade of green before he spoke up, and Shahar couldn't help but be amused at the color spectrum humans seemed to be able to shift between. Yes, of course, it won't happen again. I can't express how sorry I am. Seriously, that was inexcusable. I'm so very, very sorry. Shahar cut him off before reaching out with what appeared to be a suddenly larger and much more dangerous claw. Jack started to break out into a cold sweat when she hooked the claw around a loop of rope close to his wrist before pulling and undoing a section of one of the knots. You should be able to manage the rest from there. I'm going to head down and grab some breakfast. Feel free to join me as soon as you are able. As Shahar left the room, Jack looked at the remaining tangle of knots and tried to puzzle out where to begin. When Jack finally hobbled his way downstairs, rubbing his arms to return some feeling to them, he saw Shahar sitting at the same table as last night. She seemed to be enjoying a plate full of various cooked meat and eggs, with a small loaf of bread on the side. Jack sat down, grumbled something about the universe being out to get him and how its family tree must resemble the stitching on a baseball, before he grabbed some of the granola bars he'd brought with him. As Shahar was finishing up her breakfast, another Argun entered the inn. He looked around at the various guests, quietly eating breakfast before his gaze latched on to the odd pair. He approached the two of them with a look of indifference before stopping just shy of the table. You're Jack, I take it. Despite clearly being a question, Jack could tell it was really more of a statement. He nodded his head anyway. The Argun jerked his thumb over his shoulder, pointing toward the front of the door. Got a delivery for you from Lady Fayan.
She said to make sure you took a look and approved it before I leave.
Jack nodded and stood up. Before he could even offer his hand, the other Argoon was already walking away, presumably headed to the cart and tools. With a shrug, Jack followed with Shahar not far behind. The cart was just outside the front of the inn. At first glance, it looked rather shoddy. It was readily apparent it was cobbled together from several other carts. Many parts were obviously made from different wood types, and it was only symmetrical in the loosest sense of the word. However, on closer inspection, the cart was quite sturdy. While it was apparent many of the components had already seen plenty of hard use, nothing looked like it was going to give out anytime soon. A few of the more delicate parts even seemed relatively new. Overall, the cart was in good condition and would stand up to continuous hard use better than anything Jack could have cobbled together this quickly. Looking over the tools, Jack could see they were much the same. The handles were well worn, and the blades had been sharpened more than once, but they were sturdy and well cared for. They had plenty of life left in them. These will do perfectly. Tell Fayen that I'm quite satisfied and will be happy to do business with her again. Jack wrapped the tools back in the oily rags they had been stored in. Shahar translated while he worked. The Argoon nodded his understanding and was on his way. Jack looked to Shahar while he finished securing the tools. Let's get the cart loaded, then go see how the refining is going. I want to know about how many bars there'll be when all is said and done. If there's enough, there's one last trade I'd like to make before we head back. As Jack and Shahar approached the forges, several apprentices nudged the workers sitting next to themselves and looked pointedly towards the pair. No sooner had the whispers started up when old Markon appeared, seemingly out of thin air. His signature rag lashed out to encourage his apprentices to focus on their work rather than the now infamous duo. Having re-established order in his workplace, Markon approached the two distractions. The expression Markon wore was the exact same one he'd had when negotiating prices and dealing with Ba'arthon. Jack wasn't sure if monotone was a facial expression, but if it was, it belonged to Markon. He reminded Jack of an old math teacher he'd once had. Markon spoke first.
Come to check on our progress? Well, I don't mind admitting you were right. This is some of the purest ore I've had the pleasure to work with. You keep bringing ore of that quality around, and I'll cut a better deal next time.
Even though his face, voice, and even movements were precisely the same as Jack remembered, somehow Markon gave off the feeling that he was pleased. Jack offered his hand again, which Markon shook without hesitation this time. Jack spoke up, with Shahar translating as usual. Glad to hear it. I was hoping to get an estimation of how many bars we'd have when all is said and done. I've already traded a few of them away to Lady Fayen, and I was wondering how many I'd have left over. Also, I promised her first choice of refined ore, so if you could send a message to her when they're all finished, I'd appreciate it. Markon nodded before leading the way to the ore-turned bars.
Easily done. We should have it finished before the end of the day. I'll have them all laid out and ready for the old bat to come and inspect.
Jack could tell the insult was more of a friendly jab at a fellow tradeswoman, rather than an actual insult. Showing them a growing pile of refined bars, Markon continued,
We're about half done, as expected, double what you see here.
Jack did the math. Taking out what he owed Markon and Fayen, he should have just enough to get what he was hoping for. Perfect. Once we get back, I'm going to have to set up some infrastructure, but once that's done, you should expect a new shipment of this quantity or larger every couple of weeks, depending on how much the winter around here slows us down, that is. For the first time today, Markon's face changed in the subtlest of ways, indicating mild surprise. Jack assumed this was the Markon equivalent of picking his jaw up off the floor. When he spoke, even his voice was just barely perceptibly different.
You're going to keep running ore in the middle of the winter. You're either desperate or insane, or more likely both.
Jack had a wry smile as he shrugged his shoulders and spoke. It can't be helped. I have a lot that needs to get done, and a limited timeline to get it done. If it makes you feel any better, my people have several techniques and tools that make traveling in winter only slightly more dangerous than doing it in spring or fall. Markon's face and voice returned to normal.
It's your life. No, I'd hate to lose a supply of ore like this, so try not to die.
Jack laughed as he turned to leave. I'll do my best not to inconvenience you by dying. Jack barely heard the response muttered under Markon's breath.
See that you don't, kid.
I'm trying to be preservative with the voices that I use. I don't quite remember the voice that I had for Markon, so I'm trying my best to remember it. As the two pulled up to the hunter's lodge, Shahar was feeling some reservations. Warily looking at the skull of a Wolgan hanging over the doorway, she spoke.
Dekthal will not be happy to see me again. We didn't part on good terms.
Jack hopped down from his makeshift seat in the cart and hobbled towards the door, followed somewhat reluctantly by Shahar. He spoke over his shoulder as he walked. Maybe so, but I suspect we'll need to work with the hunters on occasion. Let's see if we can't at least get a civil working relationship established. Opening the door and walking in, Jack took a moment for his eyes to adjust to the gloom inside the large hut. Looking around, Jack couldn't help but feel a little intimidated. Everywhere his gaze wandered seemed to be another in a growing list of the most dangerous-looking Argoon Jack had seen yet. Their clothing was decorated with the teeth and other bones of their hunts. A few even wore large fanged skulls as helmets. They were all well-toned and moved with a sleek precision that spoke of a silent danger. There were many carcasses in various stages of being processed. Some were being skinned, others were having the meat removed and processed, and others were having their heads or skulls mounted as trophies. Even though everyone seemed to be focused on their various jobs, Jack couldn't help but feel that he and Shahar were the center of attention. No one was looking directly at them, but Jack occasionally caught careful glances out of the sides of their eyes and could practically feel even the tiniest of sounds being carefully analyzed. It was as though he was being hunted by every Argoon in the room. Well, everyone except one.
Shahar! Not surprised to see you here. After the falling out you and Pops had, I didn't think you'd ever walk through that door again.
Walking towards them was the single friendliest Argoon Jack had seen today. Siruan had been pleasant enough, but this young Argoon seemed positively eager to greet the pair, though Jack couldn't help but notice how little of the attention was directed his way. The youth was well-toned, though his muscles were not as developed as most other Argoon around. When he moved, it further cemented Jack's theory that Argoon were supernaturally coordinated. Though, to be fair, this youth put every other Argoon to shame in that department. It was as though he was completely aware of the exact position of every inch of his body. His movements looked slow and relaxed, but he crossed the distance between them deceptively quickly. Shahar crossed her arms and stepped forward, greeting the enthusiastic youth.
Hello again, Lanthul. I admit I wasn't looking forward to seeing the old churlish again. It's somewhat of a relief to see he's not here at the moment.
At that, Jack couldn't help but notice that most of the hunters present were chuckling at her response. Also, the female Argoon laughed a little louder and longer than the males, though once again, Lonthul put them all to shame, throwing his head back and letting out a loud barking laugh. Getting himself under control, Lonthul shook his head as he spoke.
Don't let Pops hear you say something like that. He might try and get you kicked out of the village this time.
Shahar's gaze grew a little colder after that.
I was kicked out of the village. They left me tied to a stake as a sacrifice to the dragon.
Jerking her thumb over her shoulder, she pointed at her new partner.
If it weren't for Jack and the dragon being friendly, I'd have been something's dinner by now.
At that, Lunthal's face became a mask of astonishment, quickly followed by anger. Looking around accusingly at the other suddenly sheepish hunters in the room, his voice now had a sharp edge to it.
Why wasn't I told about this?
Most hunters seemed to suddenly find their various tasks to be the most interesting things in the world, requiring all of their attention. The exception being one of the older females who met his gaze somewhat coldly.
You were away on a hunt when it happened, and your father told us not to trouble you when you got back. He was afraid you'd do something stupid, like go and challenge the dragon.
Lonthal looked like he wanted to argue further, but Shahar interrupted him with a wave of her hand.
Regardless, it all ended up all right. I have a place to stay and a new job. Speaking of which, we're here because the boss wanted to do some trading.
Shahar nodded her head towards Jack as she spoke. For the first time, Lonthal directed his full attention to Jack.
Huh! Shahar calls you the boss. That's more respect than she's shown anyone since, well, ever. What did you do to make that happen?
Jack looked somewhat confused for a moment, scratching the back of his head as he spoke. Shahar translating somewhat awkwardly due to herself being the subject of the conversation. Well, I don't know that I really did anything deserving of respect. I guess I treated her like an equal and compensated her adequately for her services? Lonthal closed his eyes and nodded sagely.
Treating her with respect to get respect? Clever. I'll have to remember that.
Jack couldn't tell if Lonthal was joking or not, so he decided to just get to business. Well, the reason we're here is to trade some refined iron for some hide and meat. How much can I get for a half-dozen bars? Lonthal's expression changed from an excited youth to an eager businessman.
Your luck! I just happened to be finishing up cleaning a cholish. For 6 purified iron bars, I'll trade you all the skin and meat I can get out of it. It's a fair amount. You got something to haul it in?
Oh, hey, Mercury. Jack pointed to the door. We've got a cart right out front. Throw in a few thigh buns and you've got a deal. Lonthal looked a little surprised at the additional request, but didn't argue.
Sure, sounds like a deal. Let me finish up here, and we'll get you loaded and on your way. It's right over here.
Walking over, Jack noticed a churlish was something like a cross between a deer and a rabbit, in that they were a large quadruped with overdeveloped hind legs. Jack couldn't help but imagine how far and fast this thing must have been able to jump. Once startled, they must have been almost impossible to catch, leaving him to believe that Lonthal must be one hell of a stealthy hunter. Jack couldn't help but be a little impressed by the eager youth. Well, yeah, how you doing, Mercury?
So, if you're not in the village anymore, where are you staying these days?
Shahar smiled her favorite intimidating smile. It was full of a few too many sharp teeth for Jack's comfort.
With the dragon, of course. Jack and I have a working relationship with her, and in return, we get room and board, among other benefits.
Lonthal looked more than a little surprised this time.
You're staying with the dragon? Aren't you afraid she's going to eat you?
Shahar couldn't help but have a little fun at the expense of Lonthal's inexperience.
Not at all. You could learn a thing or two from Jack here. If you treat a lady with the respect she deserves, she won't bite. Usually.
At last, Lonthal looked back and forth between Jack and Shahar with wide eyes, as though trying to discern any hidden meaning to Shahar's words. Meanwhile, the women around the hut were laughing at his misfortune. Jack merely shrugged with an understanding smile on his face. Don't look at me for answers. I know better than to get in the way of a woman having fun in her prey. Shahar decided not to translate that last bit and left Lonthal in the dark. Lonthal decided it was best to shut his mouth and finish up his work. However, he couldn't escape the laughter of the woman around him.